Hi there, everybody, and welcome to the June edition of our webinar series. This month, we're going to be talking about the effects of media on survivors of sexual assault. So as usual, just our little warning that some of the content you're about to hear might be a little bit upsetting for some folks. So please practice good self-care and step away or pause the playback if you need to. Also, we'd like to note, of course, that the Women's Resource Center is located on Treaty 2 territory and also operates on Treaty 1 territory. And these are the lands of the Anishinaabeg, Cree, Oji-Cree, Assiniboine, Dakota, and Dene peoples, and also comprise the homeland of the Métis Nation. So here's a little bit of a roadmap of where we're going to be going for today's presentation. It's going to be a little bit of a shorter one. So we're going to be talking first about how social media can influence survivors of sexual assault. We're going to be talking about how entertainment media, so like movies and TV shows, things like that, can impact survivors of sexual assault. We're going to be talking about how news media can impact survivors of sexual assault. And finally, we'll have, of course, our contact info up for you at the end. So to start, let's talk about social media, because especially since about 2017, with the rise of the Me Too movement, we've seen how greatly social media can influence not only the public at large, but also survivors of sexual assault. So I think it's pretty well known that social media has a pretty great power to influence or change how the public at large views certain issues, certain phenomena, and sexual assault is no exception to this. And again, especially since 2017 with the rise of the Me Too movement, which saw a huge number of survivors of sexual violence utilizing social media to try and change the narrative around sexual violence. On social media, survivors are actually able to observe the treatment of other survivors of sexual violence and sexual assault. And this can actually prevent some survivors from coming forward. So things like the presence of harmful or incorrect language around sexual violence or assault, the use of rape myths, which we've covered in previous editions of our webinar series. So if you want to go back and learn a little bit more about that. Seeing negative treatment of other survivors of sexual assault on social media can be extremely harmful to self-esteem and can influence someone's ability to heal from trauma. And it can result in cyberbullying in a lot of instances where survivors of sexual violence and assault are just relentlessly cyberbullied after sharing their experiences on social media. However, it's also really important to note that social media can also offer a modicum of social support for survivors. It's been found that having social support, whether it's through a friend group, coworkers, fellow students, that kind of thing, is integral for survivors of sexual assault, being able to process their experiences and being able to get on a path to healing that is working for them. And actually, in a 2023 study, it was found that anonymous survivor Instagram accounts, so an Instagram account where survivors of sexual assault can anonymously submit their experiences and have them posted on an Instagram account anonymously. It was found that these accounts were able to, quote, provide support and validation to students exposed to campus sexual misconduct, as well as highlight structural forces that may be contributing to a culture where sexual misconduct is normalized. So just like somebody's friend group or family or coworkers or fellow students may be a network of social support for somebody who's experienced sexual assault, an online modicum of sexual support, like a survivor Instagram account, for example, can also be linked to reduced mental health impacts for survivors of sexual violence. So as much as social media can be harmful for survivors of sexual violence and assault, it can also be really helpful in finding a community that is able to help reduce those mental health impacts. Like I mentioned just briefly before, the Me Too movement of 2017 generated a space where survivors could share their experiences, and that resulted in some positives and negatives. So the positives were that it provided that modicum of social support in an online space rather than a offline physical space. And that was helpful for survivors to be able to share stories with each other and support each other. However, it also resulted in some experiences of cyberbullying, and that kind of thing, especially when the perpetrators of the sexual assault or sexual misconduct were particularly notable or famous, because the Me Too movement was rooted originally in exposing sexual violence and misconduct in Hollywood spaces. So a lot of the perpetrators were more famous or notable, or held some sort of social power. But the Me Too movement also caused a massive societal shift in how, when, and where experiences of sexual violence are discussed. As prior to this 2017 Me Too movement, talking about sexual assault and sexual violence in online spaces was not as common as it had become after and during the Me Too movement. Typically, experiences of sexual violence and assault we know are stigmatized, and people tend to refrain from talking about them in public spaces. But this kind of space generated by the Me Too movement provided an online public forum for sexual violence and sexual misconduct to be discussed in a way that kind of helped to reduce stigma, and provide that public forum for discussing the impacts of sexual violence and assault that people were experiencing. The effects of the Me Too movement, while we witnessed them in real time and were able to see these effects that it had, and the positive impact that social media can have for survivors of sexual violence and assault, these effects are actually still being studied quite intensely. And there's new studies coming out all the time about how the Me Too movement has affected survivors of sexual assault. So be sure to keep your eye on that space if you're interested in seeing kind of how the research develops down the road. So let's move on to entertainment media. So entertainment media, I'm talking things like movies or television, even things like advertisements, because we know that the entertainment that we consume can also greatly influence how ourselves view things like sexual violence and how the public at large views sexual violence, because these types of media have such wide reaches, and are so influential for folks who are consuming them. So, a quote from a 2020 study says that media portrayals might influence, reinforce, or modify how the public responds to incidents of sexual violence and their support for prevention efforts. And media might construct a lens through which the public can understand who is affected by sexual violence, what forms it takes, why it happens, and who is responsible for addressing it. So because this is the case, it's so important that we have something called media literacy when it comes to portrayals of sexual violence, because it really affects how the public views and thinks of sexual violence, the stereotypes that it ascribes to it, the myths that are prominent within discourse on sexual violence. From another 2023 study from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, media literacy is essentially the awareness that images, social media, movies, and other forms of media are creations which have subtext and messages attached to them. So on another level, media literacy is also the ability to decode the meta messages, or deeper meanings and takeaways, what's communicated but not said, that are entering our minds and shaping our norms when we consume media. So essentially, having good media literacy around sexual assault is the ability to be able to pick it apart when we consume media specifically around sexual assault, and asking questions about what's real, what's not, what might be exaggerated, what might be being left out, what might be being glossed over. So if we take the example, because we're talking about entertainment media, if we think about crime TV shows, so things like CSI or Law and Order, things like that, and if we think of how they depict sexual assault, we should be asking ourselves questions like, are they romanticizing or sensationalizing it? Are they perpetuating stereotypes and myths? What are those stereotypes and myths? And how do we debunk those stereotypes and myths? Do they gloss over problematic themes or relationships for the sake of the story without it providing any kind of context? Are they portraying victims or survivors in a particular way that's not accurate? So these are just some of the questions that make up good media literacy around sexual assault. Recognizing that entertainment media, such as movies and TV shows, are communicating messages, but it's our job to kind of pick those messages apart and determine what's real, what's not real, what might be exaggerated, all of those kinds of things. So studies have actually looked at the real life implications of sexual assault portrayals in entertainment media, movies and TV mostly, and have found that they significantly impact society's perceptions of sexual violence, and especially for children and youth. And this is a quote again from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. It says, "Things like movies and media are the standard in which many children make sense of the world and their place in it. The media also shapes how they interact with others and their future." So children and youth spend a lot of time watching movies and TV, and the ways that movies and TV depict things like sexual assault and sexual violence are really going to impact how they view those things going forward. So it's important that children understand that media entertainment media does not always accurately represent things like sexual violence, and it's important that children have good media literacy and are able to question and criticize and pick apart depictions of things like sexual violence so that we're not perpetuating harmful myths, stereotypes, and assumptions about sexual violence. And in this same study that has looked at the real life implications of portrayals of sexual violence in entertainment media, there was a finding specifically related to the issues of stereotypes and myths, where it's been found that representations in media have historically adhered to binary patriarchal fantasies of how members of society should act according to their gender. And these patriarchal foundations instill harmful norms and standards, which encourage and normalize acts of sexual violence. So yeah, again, if we go back to thinking about crime shows like your CSIs, your Law and Orders, those kinds of things, um, yeah, they do kind of adhere to this binary patriarchal depiction of sexual assault. Lots of times there may also be racist elements or anti-LGBT elements in the stories that are being told. And that intersectional lens is also a part of ensuring that good media literacy is being undertaken when we're consuming media where sexual violence is discussed, so that we don't perpetuate these stereotypes and myths and assumptions and ensure that sexual violence does not become normalized. News media is another type of media that often depicts sexual violence. In this case, they're depicting sexual violence as it occurs in the real world. And the way that news media reports on cases of sexual violence also greatly impacts the way that society at large views the issue. News media coverage can influence also the perpetuation of myths and stereotypes around sexual assault. They can influence the general societal perceptions of how sexual assault occurs, who it occurs to, and how. And they can also influence the creation of a typology of victim or survivor. So the typical characteristics that a victim or survivor does or quote unquote should have. So just like entertainment media and social media, news media also has great capacity to influence the way that society views sexual assault. And in this case, it influences the ways that society views actual issues of sexual assault in the real world. For example, there was a study of the implications of news media coverage of sexual assault cases, also by the National Sexual Violence Resource Center. And it was found that portrayals were found to have a very real implication on how society viewed sexual assault survivors in terms of what it looks like. Additionally, these portrayals were found to impact whether victims felt like they were victims in their own experience of sexual assault. So there's a huge responsibility on news media to ensure that sexual violence is being reported in a responsible way that does not perpetuate myths and stereotypes, that doesn't lean into any assumptions, that accurately depicts issues of sexual assault in a way that is meant to minimize harm to the greatest degree. So yeah, everybody, of course, has a role to play when it comes to sexual violence prevention. And actually, the CDC, the Centers for Disease Control, have noted that the media can play an important role by partnering with public health organizations to ensure that their portrayals of sexual violence are factual, non-biased, and do not inadvertently blame victims, and include prevention messages and stories about sexual violence. So these were a few of the recommendations that the CDC had in respect to how news media can use their platform responsibly to play a role in sexual violence prevention. I'd like to note actually that news media organizations in Canada, so Global News, CTV, CBC, often advertise on their websites their journalistic or editorial standards, which generally include things like commitments to non-biased and factual reporting. However, because negative language around sexual assault, myths and stereotypes are so prevalent, sometimes portrayals can be lacking, and it's important to make a commitment to non-biased factual reporting that minimizes harm specifically related to sexual assault, because these stories are reported so often and the myths and stereotypes are so deeply ingrained that we want to make sure that news media is especially conscious of how they're reporting on sexual violence to ensure that it's being done responsibly. So some other ways that news media can contribute to a culture of sexual violence prevention, they can ensure to be using the correct terminology in reporting. There are quite a number of documents out there that identify best practices around terminology in sexual violence reporting. One of them is the CDC's Sexual Violence Media Guide, which we're going to talk about briefly on the next slide. They can partner with anti-sexual violence organizations. They can ensure to frame sexual violence reports as health and human rights issues rather than just an issue of crime, which is often the case in sexual violence reporting. Currently, it's framed as a crime issue, where in reality, sexual violence is a health and human rights issue, and framing it that way can lead to promoting a culture of sexual violence prevention. Increased reporting of outcomes of sexual violence cases. And this one is tricky because it's noted in that CDC study that outcomes including perpetrator consequences or prevention messaging generally were reported infrequently. Although outcomes may not be known at the time of reporting, traditional media might be missing an opportunity to integrate prevention messages with current or breaking news. So it's a good idea to increase the reporting of outcomes for sexual violence cases where known, as that can lead to a culture of sexual violence prevention. Um, and that again, that's tricky because outcomes might not be known at the time, but devoting more resources to being able to follow up on cases, follow them through the courts, um, is an opportunity again for news media outlets to be able to integrate prevention messages and take on more of an advocacy role, which is in line with a lot of the journalistic and editorial standards that are listed on media outlets' websites, that they want to take a non-biased view, apart from where advocacy might be an option. So this is the Center for Disease Control's Sexual Violence Media Guide. It's just a clip of one of the pages. It's a multi-page document, but this is the piece specifically around language, and it talks about the language to avoid and the language to use instead, and why it matters that we use that language. So for example, if we go down to the middle here, you want to avoid saying that somebody engaged in and move over to saying they were forced to, because the term engaged in assumes that the victim was an active participant, negating the fact that they were forced to participate and it actually, the act was violent. So being really conscious of our language makes a huge difference in how society views sexual assault. And it also makes a huge difference in ensuring that acts of sexual violence are viewed as acts of violence, and they're not neutral acts. There's no two-siding an issue of sexual violence. So making sure that we're appropriately using the right language is really important. And as I mentioned, there are quite a number of resources online that news media can access in order to ensure that they're following best practices identified by health and social justice organizations that work with sexual violence all the time. So this one, as I mentioned, is from the CDC, but there's also one from the National Sexual Violence Resource Center, and I'm sure many other ones. And these are the most up-to-date resources with the that have identified the best practices. So that's what we've got for you today. Of course, please feel free to contact us at any point if you have any questions or concerns, if you're looking for access to resources, anything like that. Um, our inbox is always open. So thanks for joining us, and we'll see you next month.